Hello and welcome to this independent special online event about the general election, the landslide. If you can still remember it from last week, I'm still recovering from sleep deprivation. Although I was very chipper about it. I didn't know I could stay up all night and keep functioning, and I didn't moan, Anand. I'm joined by a stellar panel of guests, starting with Professor Anand Menon, Director of UK and a Changing Europe, colleague of mine at King's College London, and the world's greatest expert on Brexit. My colleague Kate Devlin, Whitehall and political editor of The Independent, and my other colleague, Andrew Grice, who used to be The Independent's political editor and is one of the best commentators around. So let's get started. Let's not mess around. We have lots and lots of questions from you, the readers. Thank you very much for that. Let me just find the first one. Michael Whitmore. Now, I didn't choose these questions. Just this is a question about Tony Blair, right? I didn't choose these questions.
Tony Blair.
But Michael Whitmore said, "What are the similarities and differences in how this Labour government can get things done compared to Tony Blair's?"
I think the biggest single difference is when Tony Blair was elected, growth was 4.5%, which meant that he could be very cautious, and Labour were very, very cautious in their first term, but still stick money into public services because you had that growth. Growth now, we were celebrating this morning because growth was 0.4%.
Yeah, great triumph for the new Labour government. It retrospectively
Absolutely.
raised
the
the level of growth.
Strong growth, and I was thinking the word strong has changed meaning. So I think that is the biggest single fundamental difference between the two.
Kate?
I think the similarity between the two is that they're both incredibly lucky generals. And Tony Blair was just an incredibly lucky leader. I know you're going to tell me how talented he was. You're going to tell me what a great government it was. But he also was quite lucky. The economy was already turning around in 1996, and he rode that wave very successfully.
Yeah.
Now, whatever you say about Rishi Sunak, rightly or wrongly, he has actually spent a lot of the last year trying to solve a lot of problems, because as a technocrat, he thought that he would get rewarded for that and that the voters would love him. He was wrong about that, but he has solved some of the problems for Keir Starmer. And also, I think the economy is also going to be turning around, and things like this will be seen as entirely things that Keir Starmer has done, and so he'll be quite lucky that way.
Andy, you had a front row seat in the Blair government.
Yeah, and I remember 97 very well, and it just doesn't feel like that, even though the result of the majority is the same under Keir Starmer. It feels very different. And even talking to Labour people, there isn't the euphoria there was in 1997. I think they know that they've got a much tougher challenges ahead because of the economy, and as Anand has said, and it all goes back to that. And I think they will have to do one thing which Tony Blair did do, which is to make the case for investment in public services. There's not going to be enough money to rebuild public services. And so I think that later in the first term, they'll have to do what Blair did and Gordon Brown did in the New Labour second term, which was to raise taxes to pay for the health service. And there was a clue, I think, in Rachel Reeves's first speech where she said that she would ask the Treasury to do an audit of her spending inheritance. Now, that could pave the way for a debate about taxes, not to break the promises in the Labour manifesto on income tax, national insurance and VAT, but to look at other taxes, which they didn't rule out during the general election campaign.
Yeah, that was interesting there, because I thought she said during the campaign that she wasn't going to do that trick of saying, I've looked at the books, it's worse than I thought, I've got to put up taxes.
But I think they're starting to do that across the piece, actually, because we're getting audits of the National Health Service. They're going to have a review of sentencing to help solve the problems in prisons. And I think you'll see other ministers saying we've got to look at our inheritance. The word audit is going to be a useful word for Labour, I think, because they will then create the narrative that they have inherited these problems from the Tories. Now, it won't work forever to blame everything on the Tories, but I think they can set the parameters of the debate, and they're doing that in the early days of the administration.
Yeah.
And I think they may take the public with them on that.
Wes Streeting is doing the same thing in health. He's commissioned a review of health. This is hitting the ground reviewing. I mean, this isn't the sort of decisive, prepared action that we were expecting, is it?
So I think they're doing two things, right? And one is they're winning the piece. You know, they're doing exactly what David Cameron did in 2010, and they're defining what just happened. And they are defining it as absolute chaos from the Tories. It's even worse than you thought. And they will just keep hammering that for years and years and years, much like David Cameron did.
Yeah.
But then I think you're right. The other problem is that they have allowed expectations to run away during this election, probably because they had to, because the electorate is just so sick of nothing working in Britain. It's memes. It's, you know, it's kind of what everybody thinks. But expectation management has been missing. And you're right. They're hitting the ground reviewing, and people want results pretty soon.
I mean, the difference with David Cameron is he inherited a state that worked. Okay, so the health service was in pretty good shape.
It was in very good shape.
Things were in pretty good shape when. So actually, that gave you a bit more room for manoeuvre. The problem that Labour have now is, even if you come out and say, "Oh my God, things are dreadful," people still want things to change because they can't get to see a GP or whatever it is. So it's a very different starting position.
They have to show tangible improvements, and they have to show improvements on things like the health service, which I think was a much bigger issue in this election in terms of determining the result than we all wrote about at the time.
Yeah.
There was a lot of focus on the economy and immigration, but if you look at reasons why people didn't vote for the Tories, it was, for a lot of people, it was the NHS is broken. That's why Wes Streeting is using that language now. But it's no use saying it's broken if you can't fix it. They've got a couple of years to show within a couple of years, they've got to show tangible improvements which are going to affect people in their daily lives.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've got a question from Sean Mansfield asking about that. I mean, can it actually be done? I mean, can the NHS be fixed?
I mean, yes. Whether you can show really meaningful improvements within 5 years is a slightly more open question. Whether you can show progress within 5 years without spending significant amounts of money, I suspect the answer is no.
Yeah. I mean, but Keir Starmer during the campaign sometimes used language which suggested that he was going to clear the backlogs, the coronavirus backlogs, within 5 years, the 5 years of a parliament. Yeah. Now that strikes me as over-promising and guaranteeing to under-deliver.
Yeah, and there's also with Wes Streeting, I think, actually, this was very evident at the Tony Blair conference, this faith in
Did you go to the Tony Blair conference?
I sort of tuned in and out online in a grumpy, resentful manner. But I found that the faith in technology that was being expressed, and I say this as a proud Luddite partly, but I was just thinking, really, is it that easy? And I do worry about that. I mean, there's some stuff like, the IT kit in the health service is rubbish. Yeah. But again, that's not going to be free to fix.
No, absolutely not. Right, well, let's just take a break from readers' questions and just go back to our memories of the election campaign. Let's ask each one of you in turn for your election moment and your sort of the summation of your feelings about the election. Andy?
Well, I was up for Liz Truss. I was writing frantically at the time, like all of us were, but I did break off to watch the result.
What was that? It was about sort of 5:45?
5:30ish, I think. Yeah. It's a bit of a blur, isn't it now?
Yeah.
And I was very, very pleased to see the result, not because I have any ill will towards Liz Truss, but because an old school friend who lives in Norfolk, had rang me the day before the election and said, "What's going to be the Portillo moment?" So I said, "It's going to be close to you in Norfolk. Watch out for Liz Truss." However, I have to admit, my prediction wasn't perfect because I also told him to watch out for Jeremy Hunt. I thought Jeremy Hunt was going to lose, and he didn't. He held on.
That was an astonishing moment.
Yeah.
Anand?
I mean, I can't get beyond the initial press conference. I mean, the combination of the rain and the music. As a metaphor for what had gone before and what came afterwards. I mean, you couldn't make it up.
Yeah,
quite frankly.
It was an astonishing moment.
Yeah, it really was.
Kate.
So my moment of the election, it's a bit left field. But I'm from North Antrim, which since before I was born has been represented by a Paisley, and we all expected would continue being represented by a Paisley, probably for the rest of my lifetime. And in a real absolute shocker, which nobody in Northern Ireland saw coming, it's not represented by Ian Paisley anymore, and it's now represented by Jim Allister from the TUV. And the easiest way to explain that is that Ian Paisley has been out hardlined.
Yeah.
There's a more hardline unionist. But I think it's a bigger story for the election. It's a bigger story for the rest of the UK, because why has that happened? It's because unionists feel that there's a border down the Irish Sea, and it's a Brexit problem.
Yeah.
And it's still a problem for Keir, and it shows that a lot of issues about Brexit still need to be sorted out, and it's going to be a big problem for him as
Well,
Prime Minister.
and Jim Allister was allowed to speak in the first debate of the new Parliament to elect the Speaker.
Because he's a party leader.
Even though he's a leader of a party with one MP, which I thought was because the UUP have got one MP and they weren't allowed to speak. Anyway, he was allowed to speak, and he complained about putting a border through the United Kingdom. I mean, how much of a problem, Anand, is this going to be for the new government? I mean, Brexit more generally, not just
the whole
Northern
Brexit
Ireland.
thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
All the small questions.
I mean, it'll be a problem over time. So, for instance, this autumn, the European Union is planning on bringing in border checks. That will be immensely important for people because it will make it a lot slower getting in. There will be queues. The government has to put in place our border checks on food and plant and animal products coming in. That might have an impact on food prices. So there's a renegotiation of fisheries due. So there are all sorts of small landmines sort of scheduled for Brexit. On the sort of big question, I think this government isn't planning to... Well, two things. One, this government will profoundly change the tone in our relationship with the European Union. I think that's going to take some getting used to. We have a government that genuinely wants to be friends and partners with European states, doesn't see the relationship as zero-sum or competitive. And that tone will take some getting used to because we're so used to something completely different.
Yeah.
But in substantive terms, my sense is they're not going to do very much. They're going to tinker around the edges of the existing trade agreement. They might sign some deals on security. There's not going to be a wholesale change in our trading relationship with the European Union. And
That's going to disappoint a lot of our readers and a lot of Labour voters. I mean, Mike Percival asks, now that Labour has a huge majority, why shouldn't they apply to rejoin the customs union?
I think that they might go further than we expect, and Keir Starmer's opening shots in this debate are quite strong, I think. I spoke to a lot of Labour people, frontbenchers now in government, before the election, and of course they're not going to breach their manifesto promises to stay out of the single market and the customs union, but there are people high up in the government now who want to achieve a form of customs union by the end of the 5-year Parliament. Now that's very ambitious. And it's not at all clear that the EU...
How can you have a form of customs union that isn't a customs union?
Incremental, lots of deals, lots of alignment. They want the security deal to go way beyond defence, to cover energy, climate and migration. That's a big ask, and I'm not sure with the instability in France and weak governments in Paris and Berlin you can achieve that, but they are aiming high, and I think they're going to aim higher than most people expect.
Just to come on back on that, I'd say two things. The sort of let's do little bits of a customs union is not going to be on offer, I don't think. I don't think the EU, anything that smells of a Swiss-type deal, the EU will run a mile from, and a load of separate little agreements they're not going to do.
What, just because it's too much
messy,
trouble
it's
for them?
hard to govern. There's a lot of paranoia amongst some of the Western European states about the future of the single market as is. And they see us getting little bits of deals as problematic in terms of other member states. The customs union, the problem with the customs union, apart from the fact they've ruled it out, and I do hope they don't go through this semantic trick of saying, we said the customs union, this is a customs union. Okay.
They might.
But yeah, they might. But I so hope they don't. Is that you have to go around the world having come in and said this is the new reliable Britain and say, that trade deal we struck 4 or 5 years ago, I'm really sorry, but actually it's got to go. And I think there's a cost to that. There's a cost to that, particularly if you're dealing with
What you'd have to say to Australia and New Zealand,
or all those countries in the CTPTG that, actually we can't do this anymore. And I don't think they would necessarily want to do that.
Kate?
So I think it's going to be really interesting to watch the language around this. And I completely disagree with Anand. I know that you don't want them to do that, but that's politics. And I think this is going to be really interesting, and in a wider sense, is do we have a government now that does politics?
Yeah.
Because we haven't had a government that does politics for a couple of years, and we haven't had a government that kind of instinctively understands the space that can be created between these things where people can have things that work for us and work for you, and there's a form of language that can be brought together. Technocrats like Rishi Sunak have managed to do things by kind of sidestepping politics, by not really understanding how much can be created by using politics.
Yeah.
And so I think it would be really interesting to see. There's definitely a lot of people in Labour who do. Is Keir Starmer the kind of Prime Minister who instinctively understands how much he can achieve from that? And I think if he does, then I think Andy's right, they can go a lot further. But at the same time, they're going to have to roll the pitch, again, which we haven't seen from governments for a long time. And they're going to have to reassure voters that when they say that they believe in democracy, they really do.
That's fascinating.
And it's a tightrope. It's an absolute tightrope.
No, but it's interesting because most people have this impression of Keir Starmer as a sort of administrator or bureaucrat, sort of glorified civil servant, really. But actually, you're right. He's a politician, and he's proved that he's actually quite a good politician because he's got himself elected, and that will be very interesting to watch. Also interesting that you mentioned Rishi Sunak, because we haven't had many questions about the Tory party. I mean, are they completely irrelevant for the next 4 years?
No, I don't think they are. I mean, they might look it, and if they have a civil war, and if they lurch to the populist right, then they will be irrelevant, and they will deserve to be. But I think that they will pull themselves together. I'm more optimistic about their future than a lot of Tories are themselves. And I think that, we shouldn't forget that this party is the most successful party, the oldest party in Western democracies. They've been in power for 67 of the last 100 years. That didn't happen by accident. They can be a very ruthless election-winning machine. They have a huge problems to deal with Nigel Farage, which I'm sure we'll come on to. But I wouldn't be giving them the last rites yet. I think they will bounce back quicker than many people expect, if they can avoid a civil war in the next leadership election.
I think one really interesting question for me, and I don't know what you two think, is where the Liberal Democrats decide to attack the government from. Because it's conceivable. I mean, one of the interesting things about Lib Dems, if you look at Lib Dem candidates, is they were all over the place on VAT on school fees. Right?
I hadn't noticed.
And they were all over the place because actually a lot of them come from precisely those areas where loads of people send their kids to private schools, in which case you're attacking the Labour from the right. If you're attacking Labour from the right, you're eating up Conservative space, aren't you? So I think that is going to be so pivotal with 70 Lib Dem MPs. Which direction? They might do both, of course.
Well, they are Liberal Democrats. I mean, they're bound to do both. I mean, they were going to attack from the left on sewage, which they think can be solved for free.
Yeah, and they had a very tax and spending manifesto.
Yeah, but that's very interesting about school fees. How do you think Nigel Farage is going to play out?
It's going to be fascinating. I think he is going to actually find out that the oxygen from Parliament isn't actually as much as it has been in recent years. I think
he did look like quite a small figure, didn't he? In the House of Commons, he didn't sort of dominate or come across particularly.
No, and in some ways you can actually get a lot more publicity outside Parliament than you can inside. And once you have to start obeying the rules and kind of getting slightly bogged down in things that he doesn't want to do, that he wants to rebel against. But will anybody notice? But no, look, I mean, his impact on the election has been absolutely seismic. His impact on what's going to happen for the next 5 years shouldn't be underestimated, not least what it's going to do to the Conservative Party, who, do appear to be having a bit of a
nervous breakdown in public.
Nervous breakdown.
No, but I mean, that's what parties parties do after election defeats. They do tend to show signs of nervous breakdowns, isn't it? But and I don't think, Andy, I don't agree with you about the Tory party pulling itself together. I think if anything, we have not tested the limits of Liz Trussism yet. I mean, this is the party that thought that Liz Truss was a good idea as a Prime Minister. I mean, the party members thought that But the MPs certainly didn't. They really
They may
disagreed.
have to go through another leader and another populist Liz Truss leader. It could well be that the new leader chosen later this year will not be the one who leads them into the next general election in 5 years' time. They may have to go down before they go up. I wouldn't rule that out. In terms of Farage, I think the debate is not really going to be about whether the Tories take over Reform or Reform mounts a reverse takeover of the Tories. I think where they'll end up eventually is to seek a kind of electoral pact with Reform, with Farage, because the Tories know that when they had a version of that in 2019, when Farage stood down his candidates in Tory-held seats, Boris Johnson won a majority of 80, and that was a pivotal factor in that result.
I think with that, one of the big questions over the next 5 years is how big a target Labour provide for Farage at the next election, because depending on what happens with immigration, the small votes, it could be that it's Labour who are vulnerable next time around.
Yeah.
If you look at a lot of those northern seats, it's Reform who are in second place. Far from definite this is going to happen. I'm not one of those people who the day after the election said 170, oh my God, that's a nightmare. What are Labour going to do? They're going to lose this. You actually have a degree of agency as a government that means that you can shape public opinion as well as respond to it. But I do think whether or not Farage can start getting cut through with Labour voters is one of the really interesting and important questions, because if he's threatening Labour, it changes the arithmetic a little bit.
I mean, how is Labour going to deal with the votes?
Well, I have very little faith that their current plan is going to stop the votes.
Yeah, but the Tory plan didn't stop the votes either.
Yeah, I have very little faith that anyone knows how to stop the votes. You have desperate people flying desperate circumstances. They're going to come.
Yeah. When you talk to them in private, they say the answer is through the EU. I referred to it earlier. They would like migration to be part of the security pact. Now that is a big ask, especially with all the
that's a big opportunity for Farage, isn't it?
Turbulence in European capitals at the moment. A weakened Macron in France, a weakened Scholz in Germany. It's not going to be easy to get for them to get the bandwidth to address migration. They're still sorting out their own migration policy, let alone trying to do one with the UK. But there are people in the Labour Party who think they've got a chance of getting a returns agreement, which if we were to take people from Europe, then from the EU, then they would allow us to return people who came across the channel in small boats.
But what European government do you think, given populism on the continent, is going to accept a deal that sees them accepting more people than we do?
Well, if you remember, the Tories before the election were warning that if Labour got a returns agreement, we in the UK would take 100,000 migrants from. Yeah, but I think it's probably on the money, and that's why Labour didn't talk about a returns agreement during the election campaign, because they knew the Tories would come back at them. But I think that's going to come back as potentially a government policy if they can get on the same page as the EU. You couldn't do a returns agreement with France. You'd have to do it with the whole of the EU.
But how does it help us if we end up taking more?
Stop the boats.
Yeah, okay. It doesn't look so uncontrolled. I suppose.
Absolutely.
I mean, that would be a deterrent in a way that Rwanda was never going to be.
Yeah.
If you were going to get sent straight back, why would you risk your life crossing in a small boat?
No, but why would Anand's question is a good one. Why would European leaders, EU leaders, agree to something that looks like giving in to the British?
Well, they would send 100,000 people here.
Yeah.
And if you look at the relationship as a whole, what ministers are now talking about is not a renegotiation. There's no appetite for that, either amongst the British public or, crucially, as you said, and amongst the EU. But there is a strong push for a reset, and you can achieve a lot. Ministers think, without a new treaty, without changing rejoining the institutions, and a deal on migration, could be part of that.
And I think what would work for both sides is, like you say, something that looks controlled, something that looks under control. Yeah. So if you talk to Tory MPs over the last year, Tory MPs miles away from Dover, miles away from NEC, they said that the outsized impact. Now we know, numbers arriving is tens of thousands. But if you ask them, they would say that their constituents thought it was way more than that.
Yeah.
There was an outsized impact that the words small boats was having. Now, what they really wanted was their government to stop talking about it. because they were failing to do anything about it. And they felt that their government kept highlighting the fact that they were failing to do something about it.
Yeah.
But if you just had something that looked like it was under control, you could take it away from the front pages. You could look as if you were in charge, grown-up government. And that's not just the UK. That's also beaches in France, beaches in Italy. You know, there's a win-win for everybody.
So you're saying essentially that 50, 60, 70,000 uncontrolled is less politically palatable than 100,000 controlled. I mean, you're getting... Okay, that's interesting.
I think that's probably right, isn't it? I mean, I think that could work. Although you can imagine how Nigel Farage would attack it. But I mean, the interesting thing would be what's happening to legal immigration at the same time. Which is presumably going to come down anyway. I mean, Labour have come into power at a time when it is already coming down in a sense. So.
Yeah, I mean, so there's some things which are just easy because the Hong Kongers aren't going to be coming in the same numbers, the Ukrainians aren't coming in the same numbers.
Yeah.
The other stuff is more difficult because yes, the numbers are coming down, but one of the implications of that is that the OBR will revise its growth forecast downwards because, you know, if you're having fewer foreign students coming, that is very bad for university revenues, and there's a looming financial problem for but it's not looming, it's happening.
It's happening, absolutely.
Over the last year, the number of applications for social care visas is down 75%. Now, you know, in the old politics, it's a triumph immigration is coming down, but you've got to wonder who's going to be doing those jobs. So again, I mean, as ever with immigration, what needs to happen is a debate about the trade-offs.
Yeah.
And actually for Labour, there's a possibility of that happening because this is the first government I remember that has been elected by a voter base that is pretty relaxed about immigration and doesn't tend to think immigration is one of the major issues the country faces. Now, whether they take advantage of that or not, we'll wait and see.
Well, isn't that a question of whether Labour can achieve what Kate was saying Tory MPs wanted, which is just change the subject?
Yeah.
And whether Nigel Farage is going to let them change the subject. I mean,
and Labour will be nervous that Reform came in second place behind Labour in 89 seats.
Yeah.
Now, although distant second place in most of those, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think that Labour is worried about reform. They're already talking about how do we combat them because they can see what's happened on the continent and in France and Germany and Netherlands and so on. So the Labour doesn't feel as confident as a party should feel after winning a majority of 170.
Well, but, I mean, isn't that because the vote share that Labour won was so low? I mean,
to an extent, but I do think they're focusing too much. I mean, with all due respect, I found that Tony Blair article a bit weird because the focus on...
You disagree with Tony Blair?
No, I didn't say I disagreed. I said I found it weird. Which is a very different thing. But, you know, it almost sort of has the hallmarks of a self-fulfilling prophecy, this, that we're going to talk a lot about the reform threat and build it up, and it's not obvious how much of a threat reform are going to be. I mean, try your own thing first would be my advice. Don't, at this early stage in a parliament, when you've got this massive majority, don't start it off being terrified about those 5 MPs.
Yeah.
I'm quite torn on this one, actually, because in one way I do agree with you. And I do think, you know, this idea that, oh, well, they got so many millions of votes, but it didn't translate into the same number of MPs. I don't think that argument holds because I think the electorate knows what they're doing. And I think the electorate wanted them to come second in an awful lot of seats in order to send a signal. You know, they wanted to say, look, I want to give you a shock, guys. But on the other hand, something that keeps popping into my brain is that the British public have voted for seismic change now 3 times since 2016. And they weren't very happy with what they got after the first 2. And this is quite a legacy for Labour. It is quite an inheritance to be the third in 8 years.
The third seismic change,
and
with the people wanting something different.
Absolutely.
And if the politicians don't deliver something different, then they're going to get punished.
And they're going to get absolutely punished. And if you live by the swing, you die by the swing.
I think Labour do need to worry about reform because I don't think it's just about immigration. I think reform and Farage potentially could become a focus of opposition, of discontent, disillusionment on a whole range of economic issues unless Labour can make people feel a bit better off, really convince them that they're going to succeed on public services. There's a huge gap between politicians and the public, and Starmer's making the right noises about filling that gap and winning back people's trust using politics as public service, as he puts it.
Yeah.
But that's saying it is one thing, doing it is another. There's a huge gap between politicians and public, and a lack of trust in our politicians. There is a danger that in a couple of years, a lot of voters think Labour is just as bad as the Tories, and Reform and Farage could potentially exploit that.
But I think on the economic front, what Reform need to do is twig in the way that UKIP twigged, that you need to be a bit more towards the left on economic policy to get the voters you want. And in a sense, Reform are doing exactly the same thing UKIP did. UKIP started off as a political party that was right on culture and wanted to privatise the NHS. And guess what? Virtually no one voted for them. Then they kind of grasped the fact that actually the immigration stuff is fine, but if we can be a bit more left-wing on the economics, that is the sweet spot. And that's why, if you look at, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, you look at Le Pen in France, the difference between those parties and Reform here is they talk directly to young people about the fact that of the economic dislocation they're facing. They talk about the state, they talk about providing for people, they talk about providing housing. And the question here is whether or not Reform manage that, I think, because that can make them. I think Reform at the moment aren't a real threat on the economy because their economic policies just don't sort of meet the need of the people who aren't happy. They could adapt, though. I mean, they're nothing if not adaptable. And so I think if they do that, then that could really become an issue.
Nigel Farage is very good at changing his mind.
Yeah.
And it was very surprising, I thought, during the TV debates that he advocated privatising the NHS. I mean, that's not your sort of that's not your way to attract economically left-wing anti-immigration voters. So yeah, I mean, he's going to have to adapt that. But I mean, this is the big question for me about this election is James Kanagasuriam's sandcastle theory of politics, which is that that Boris Johnson majority of 80, everybody thought that was a huge achievement. It was going to stand for years. Boris Johnson was going to be prime minister, two-term prime minister for a decade, and of course it just washed away like a sandcastle. Is the Labour majority the same kind of insubstantial thing?
I think it's risky. I think Labour could lose next time. I mean, obviously, yes, they can control the narrative and can control the agenda. But I don't think, in a way, this election was an anti-Tory vote. It was an anti-politics vote, and that's dangerous for Labour.
That's very interesting. Because it was an anti-Tory vote.
Yeah, but I think it was also an anti-politics vote. Why did Labour only get a third of the votes? Why did Reform come second?
Well, because people were too busy voting for the Lib Dems in places where they could beat the Tories.
I think it's deeper than that. It's not just about tactical voting. And look at the success of the Greens. Look at the success of the pro-Palestinian candidates. Look at Jonathan Ashworth losing in Leicester. Look at Wes Streeting's majority being cut to 500. If something else was going on, it's not just anti-Tory. There was a lot of anti-politics there.
I think several things. I mean, there's actually a load going on with ethnic minority voters that is really interesting because they're breaking off in all sorts of different directions. We can talk about that later if you want.
Well, Hindus becoming much more Tory.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because migrants in general vote class, whereas non-migrants are tending to vote values. So that the two groups are going in different directions in terms of how they're behaving. But on the question of the Labour majority, I'd say two things. I'd say one, fragmentation has been a reality of our political system for a long time, and up to and including 2015, the vote share of the two big parties has been steadily going down.
Yeah.
Okay. And I remember Italian friends mocking me after the 2015 election about how Italian our party politics looks, because they're fragmenting. And then what happened? Then what happened is you had that period where you had two things. You had Brexit and you had Corbyn. And what those two things did was they repolarised stuff. So in 2017, the two big parties, I think, got their highest vote share since 1970.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what we saw in this election was a reversion to the 2015 trend. That's to say, the Brexit-Corbyn sort of consolidation was over, and we were back to where we were. So on the one hand, people are more likely to vote for a variety of parties. On the other hand, the other thing that is really important, I think, and James got this with his talking about the Red Wall. The Red Wall weren't seats that Labour owned by rights that the Tories won by a miracle. The Red Wall was seats that the Labour shouldn't have had
in the first place. Yeah. But they were just culturally Labour.
And what's happened, as my colleague at Oxford, Jane Green, says, is when the Red Wall went to the Conservatives, the anchor was snapped. And those seats are no longer anchored to any party. And so people will pick and choose depending on what parties offer them. Now, I happen to think this is a fantastic development. I think volatility and the rise in marginal seats is superb because it makes it harder for politicians to ignore people. But it also means that we should expect massive swings between elections. I'm not for a moment saying they're going to lose the next election. All I'm saying is we should get used to big swings.
Kate?
So on majorities, I would say, I don't think majorities are what they used to be.
Yeah.
You know, we've crossed a Rubicon.
Yeah.
And we've crossed a Rubicon, I think, with MPs, but also with voters as well. So MPs are more likely to rebel if they've seen other MPs rebel. Interestingly, I was talking to somebody senior who was in number 10 only a couple of weeks ago. And he was saying, you know, their majority, yes, it was 80, but actually with all the by-elections, it had really, really gone down to, you know, kind of 40 something. But he says there was one day where they had 200 requests for slips.
For permission not to attend to vote
from Tory MPs. Now, if you have 200 of your MPs saying, I'm sorry, I can't come into work today, it's absolutely unsustainable.
Yeah.
And I think it's also, if you have a large majority, it is in some issues actually easier to rebel, because it's easier to rebel if 100 of you are rebelling.
Yeah.
There's safety in numbers.
Absolutely.
So if we ever get to something like on the two-child policy, I think actually it would be more, you know, there would be safety in numbers of rebelling. But also, voters have started to watch these votes.
Yeah.
People sitting at home have started to watch these votes in a way that they never have before. And I actually wonder if Parliament's going to have to change because of this. So, you know, this whole system that we're...
Yeah, abolish broadcasting and do it all in private.
Doing private votes like they're having in the European Parliament next
No,
week.
not at all. But this whole thing that we have where with the first vote, people vote for it to allow it to be amended.
Yeah.
And then it's actually only the next vote that is actually the crucial one. I think an awful lot of people watching at home know that and understand that, and a lot of people don't. And we've seen that this has caused problems for voters in their for MPs in their constituencies already. And I wonder if the more and more people start to pay attention to Parliament, if we might have to just call these votes something different. If MPs are going to start demanding that they've only, you know, they haven't voted for it, they've only
voted to go
voted
to the next stage.
Keep it going or something like
Yeah.
that, because it's causing them problems on the doorstep. It really is.
Because their votes are being misrepresented by their opponents
Absolutely.
or by campaign groups.
Yeah.
I think that is absolutely true. We're not going to get away from the question which a lot of readers want to ask about, which is proportional representation. Because, I mean, this was the most, arithmetically, it was the most disproportionate result in terms of share of the vote translating to seats. And yet, suddenly, all the pressure on the left has disappeared for PR. and it's Nigel Farage who's up in arms about it.
He would have got 90 MPs if it had been proportionate. So, but to be fair to him, he's always called for it.
Yeah,
I think the debate is not going to go away, and I think if we had another disproportionate election next time, which we may well do, given all the currents that we're talking about, and the fact there were no safe seats anymore anywhere, so you could have a similar result. And I think the debate is going to really take off this time. As you know, John, we on the Independent have campaiged on. Some of us on the Independent.
The Independent has campaigned for PR.
We support it, and personally I support it. And I think the present system, although in its defence you can say it gets the result it wanted, and arguably it did do that.
Well, it was very interesting that Rishi Sunak, of all people, said what a decisive result it was when he was speaking in the House.
But I just think it becomes indefensible over time if you carry on getting totally disproportionate results. And I suspect we'll end up one day with reform, and not Nigel Farage's reform, but electoral reform. And then you would see a kind of Labour-Lib Dem alliance, not one party, not a merger, but working together in a proportional system. I have a feeling that in 10, 15 years, that may be where we end up.
Absolutely not. But what do you two think?
So interesting. I've heard a recent discussion amongst senior Tories about this issue, who were talking about the fact that it would probably split the bigger parties in the UK if we had proportional representation. Because of the first past the post system, our parties are massive coalitions. Yeah. So Labour would probably have its more left-wing elements split off, stay a kind of social democrat party in the middle. The Tories would probably also have its more right-wing elements split off, which some former cabinet ministers would not be particularly sad to discover. So if you even have senior Tories starting to warm to the idea of PR, then, you know, it does seem as if it's more on the table. I mean, the other thing I would say is we already have it for elections to Stormont. We have it for elections to the Scottish Parliament. You know, there are parts of the UK that are doing proportional representation already.
Yeah, but as you were suggesting earlier, the voters are more sophisticated, and they've actually produced a sort of proportional outcome using the existing system. Because I mean, they're giving the Lib Dems a proportional.
Precisely proportional, just about, wasn't it?
And the Conservatives and Labour obviously very disproportional. But I mean, in some ways, those were the results that people were aiming for.
I think the electorate adapts. To be honest, I think there's pros and cons to both systems. But I think the electorate are much smarter than we give them credit for.
Though it's very hard if you'll reform all the Greens, however much people adapt. I mean, with all due apologies to your readers, I'm quite a fan of first past the post, but I'm starting. Actually, the reasons why I'm starting to have doubts about first past the post is not just proportionality; it's a policy reason, and it links back to what we were saying earlier about big swings. Is I think one of the chronic public policy problems we have in this country is short-termism, and I think short-termism happens partly because when that lot are in, and the next lot come in, the next lot find it virtuous to undo what that lot did, just as a point of principle. So one of the reasons we haven't got proper social care is because if you propose it in power, we're going to knock it down, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And one of the advantages of a proportional system for me is that it might force the parties to work together, which might lead to more stable medium-term public policy.
Don't be soft, Anand.
Sorry.
All it would do would be sclerosis. It would just mean that you would never achieve change, because you'd have some sort of mishmash coalition of parties who would just be permanently in government.
But if you have a mishmash coalition of parties in government, all of whom were agreed on the need for social care, we'd have something.
Well, yeah, but I mean, the coalition that was called the Conservative Party was agreed on the need for social care and didn't do anything about it. And before that, the coalition that was called the Labour Party was agreed.
But think about the story, right? Andy Burnham has a plan for social care. It's a perfectly reasonable plan. The Tories call it a death tax. Labour panic, dump it. Yeah. 7 years later, Theresa May has a plan for social care, not entirely dissimilar to Andy Burnham's plan from 7 years ago. Labour call it a dementia tax. The Tories panic, they dump it. That sort of just sums up the dysfunctionality for me, and I wonder whether, in a more proportional system, that would happen in quite such a flagrant way.
I think there was a problem with those policies,
right?
Which was teased out by an adversarial system, but we can.
Okay.
That's possibly a debate for another time. Let's see if we've got any other questions. I like this one. Andrew Chandler, is the truth ever found in the extremes of British politics?
Rarely, I think. Thinking back to this campaign, the parties on the extremes had much less media scrutiny than the mainstream parties. And you could argue that both Farage's reform and to some extent the Greens had very unrealistic spending promises in their manifestos, which did not really get that much scrutiny.
Didn't get any scrutiny at all.
So I think it's harder for them to be held to account and to be made to tell the truth, to answer the question. And it was interesting that when Nigel Farage started to get more scrutiny, because clearly he made an impact in this campaign, he made a mistake on Russia, blaming NATO, blaming
Well, it wasn't
the West.
a mistake. That's what he actually thinks.
He believes it. Well, it was a mistake.
It was a political mistake.
Oh, sorry, yes.
In terms of reforms vote started to go down after those comments. He's way out of tune with the British public on Ukraine, and of course the revelations about reform activists and candidates. That did a lot of damage. They were going up in the polls until those two things happened, and they started to go down a bit. They peaked, went down.
But there's a common view, isn't there? I mean, especially among supporters of PR, that the parties like the Greens have something very important to say, to add to the political debate, even if they're going to be a minority.
Okay, well, look, I mean, I don't want to be controversial here, but the
Yes,
Northern Irish member of the panel is going to stand up for, yes, the extremes is sometimes where you find the truth in politics. And you ignore it, I think, at your peril. And one example I would say would be how unionists currently feel about Brexit. Another one I would say would definitely be both Brexit, but both Reform and the Greens. The SNP, not what they were, but certainly over the last 9-10 years, I think underestimated. I actually don't think that issue has gone away, and I think it's still something that Keir Starmer is going to have to deal with.
Yeah,
Well, that's very interesting.
And I think this is why politics is not easy. No, but it isn't. I mean, people, think that you can just put things in a manifesto and, kind of suddenly solve things. But politics is incredibly, incredibly difficult. And to most things, there is not an easy answer. And you have to create situations like the Good Friday Agreement where people can come together and live with entirely separate identities. And I actually think that that's not a bad analogy for where lots of people in England are at the minute, which is, we kind of talk about the red wall, we talk about the blue wall, but there's a lot of very different and distinct identities in England, and lots of people don't feel that these are being represented politically.
Anand?
I mean, just sort of avoiding the term extreme, I thought one of the really interesting things with the campaign was it was Stephen Flynn who was the only person who consistently pointed out the sort of fiscal deceit floating around the centre of this election. The IFS figure about, those spending plans are eye-watering. Okay, they're looking at something like a 2.5% real terms cut in the funding of non-protected departments, which includes, because we're talking about prisons this week, justice. It is simply fairy tale fiscal policy. And actually, because there was a kind of pact of silence between the two big parties on this. So both big parties, for instance, saying, we'll raise loads of money by clamping down on tax fraud. No, you won't. All right? But because they were both saying it, it was fine. So I think there is something to be said for a sort of party, again, I'm not going to use the word extreme for the SNP, but a party that isn't in that debate in the same way. They can talk. I mean, it's easy to speak the truth if you're not going to get elected. Okay? If you're not. But I think there is an element of truth to that,
That's fascinating. Right, we've got a very, very tough question here from Aldridge Sagala. Do you think Labour will be in government for longer than 14 years?
No. They're going to, unlike Tony Blair, they will be under fire from the left and the right. They're going to have a lot of enemies. The Greens will be an important enemy. They will hoover up votes on the left. The pro-Palestinian candidates have got to be, that issue and the Gaza debate has got to be addressed. That could cost Labour votes.
Yeah, and it's not as if it's going to be settled soon.
And on the right, they're going to be under attack from Farage, as we've talked about. So, Labour's going to have a lot of enemies. It's going to be really, really hard. With no money at the moment, if they don't get the economic growth, which they're banking on, they place a huge bet on, they put a lot of chips on growth. If they get it, they have a chance of being in power for longer, of rebuilding public services. But if they don't get the growth, they have a huge problem.
It reminds me of the bet that Rishi Sunak put at the beginning of last year on those five targets.
Stop the boats.
Actually, the stop the boats one was a very foolish target because there was no way he could have delivered on that. But the others, he thought he could get waiting lists down. He thought he could get, he thought that growth would resume, and it didn't. And so if you bet on those things wrongly, then you are going to be in trouble.
So the question is longer than 14 years.
Yeah.
And the only parties who successfully go that long, successfully get a new leader and kind of reinvent from day one. So, the SNP would be or several new leaders. So the SNP would be the kind of obvious one, didn't they do 17 or whatever? That is a fascinating question. Who takes over? Who's the heir apparent? Who would take over from Keir and give them that kind of second wind You know, that kind of, and what would that look like? How would they kind of try and start again, new but not new, a continuation, but also kind of fresh enough to be a new government? Fascinating question.
I mean, the flip side of that, I'd be very surprised if they're in about 14 years, partly because of the thing we said about swings. The flip side of that is, in a couple of years' time, that discussion about Starmer's successor is going to start. You know, who is going to succeed? How long is he going to do? Oh my God, is he already in his 60s? Blimey, that's old for a prime minister. You know, I understand that our perceptions change because we look in horror at what's happening over the Atlantic, but for here, Starmer is quite an old prime minister.
Yeah, and you'd expect him to be a 2-term prime minister, perhaps.
Well, maybe a 2-election prime minister.
But that means that by the time we get to the next election, we'll be talking about who his successor is going to be.
Yeah. The other thing, just talking about pledges, was I don't know if any of you know the answer to this. Why would the Labour Party make a pledge about growth that was comparative? I mean, we're not, especially when one of the comparators is the United States. Right? I saw that at the time and said, but that's obviously not within your gift.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anyone's got an answer. I mean,
they diluted it. It used to be one of the missions was the highest growth in the G7, and then they relegated it down the batting order. They realised it was a huge hostage of fortune to say it, and have it passed the test and got written in that way in the first place. I don't know. You're completely right about that. It was a mistake, but it's still in the manifesto. Not in the headlines, but it's still there.
But it's still there.
And it's not under their control.
Because what we really don't want is another of those silly debates about, you know, that we had on the Tories, sort of highest, if you measure it from there to there, we've got the highest growth. So if you extend out at all, then actually we're second bottom. I mean...
So to be fair, I think if we get into that debate, they're fine.
Yeah, no, if we're that close,
I mean,
that's true.
That much economic growth.
Okay.
You know, nobody can quibble.
But to go back to the Tories for a moment, I mean, if Labour stumbles, and we seem to expect that to happen, are the Tories going to be in a fit state to capitalise on that? I mean, because they don't look it at the moment.
And I think this is a bad thing for the Tories. It's a bad thing for democracy, but it's also a bad thing for the Labour government. You know, I don't think
you need a strong opposition.
You do need a strong opposition. I don't think it helps governments to just have that much of a free rein. You start making mistakes. You don't have enough people telling you you're doing the wrong thing. It's difficult.
I want to say two things on that. Firstly, it's been really interesting what Lucy Powell said in opposition and has kept saying, which is that Labour want to make parliamentary scrutiny more effective. Now, that just might be words, but they are repeating it since the election, and they're going to, they're saying we're thinking of ways to, it might be...
Who's been saying that?
Lucy Powell.
Yeah, but she's been saying that since the election.
She's been saying that. They were saying it a lot before the election.
Yeah.
But
do you think Keir Starmer agrees with her? Or is she just off on some freelance?
Policy. We'll have to wait and see. No, it is party policy. I mean, it was in the manifesto, I think. But we'll wait and see. But they have stated an intention to say we're not going to do so much secondary legislation. We're going to improve scrutiny. So
and we're going to make all announcements in Parliament first. Yeah.
Well, let's see. But on the Tory question, it's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, if they do end up forming a circular firing squad, then they're going to be in no fit state to be an effective opposition. So we'll have to see.
Well, what do you think of Kemi Badenoch? I mean, she's quite a forceful fighter, isn't she? I mean,
nice understatement.
But could she cause Keir Starmer trouble? I mean, that's.
I mean, it's not just having a good leader. That's part of it. It's being united behind that leader,
and actually standing for something.
Yeah.
I think the danger for the Tories is that they just oppose everything that the Labour government does. And there will be a lot of some goodwill, especially at the start from voters. They will want the government to succeed. So if the Tories just attack everything and still try and rerun the election that's just finished, then they will become irrelevant and they will not be back in the game and not be back in contention at the next election. They have to look forward, not back. They have to appeal to a new set of voters. It's no use careering off to the right. They've got to look at the votes they lost to Labour and the Lib Dems as well. They have to desperately need to appeal to younger voters. The crossover age at which you're more likely to vote Conservative than Labour was 39 at the previous election in 29. It's now 62, which is astonishing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I used to write pieces saying the Tories need to appeal to the under 40s. Then it was the under 50s, and now it's the under 62s, which is remarkable.
I think it's true.
We must address that.
Since 2019, they've lost almost exactly the same proportion of votes to left and right. So this argument that it was simply a reform thing. I mean, the reform thing was exaggerated because, of course, reform didn't stand in a whole load of those Tory seats in 2019.
Yes.
So you're looking at vote share change. It suddenly looked amazing because.
Well, there were a lot of seats that people thought were safe Tory seats. I mean, and Liz Truss's was one of them actually, because I think the Brexit Party didn't stand in that seat, so she had a 26,000 majority. It looked completely safe. But of course, that was a seat where UKIP got quite a large share of the vote in living memory.
But it was also the personal brand effect in reverse.
Yes,
quite powerfully.
There were some special factors in that case. But I mean, there were other seats that looked like safe Tory seats because the Brexit Party hadn't stood last time. And they really weren't safe, as we discovered.
Yeah.
Just on the age of people who vote Conservative, in some ways, I think that this is flipping and is going to start to become Labour's problem. And let me tell you why. I've lost count of the number of Tory housing ministers that I've sat with over the years, and I've said, it's you've got to win the next election, because they had to solve the housing problem and they weren't solving it, and they knew themselves, and they were admitting it privately, that was why the age of people who were starting to vote Tory was going up and up and up, because people in this country could not get on the housing ladder.
Yeah.
And overnight, on Thursday, that's now Labour's problem.
Yep.
So there's one kind of chink of life. I still think they've got desperate problems.
Except the early signs are Labour are actually going to try and do something.
Yeah,
but will it actually have any effect?
But I mean, they've been quick off the block.
And if they look as if they're trying, that's half the trick in politics, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I mean, are we looking at a situation where the Conservatives could die out? I mean, could they be? I mean, they could still be overtaken by the Lib Dems at the next election. I mean, if
the point of volatility, it doesn't necessarily mean Labour back to the Tories. I mean, it's all over.
It could mean that the Tories collapse further. I mean, there's no guarantee that they're going to come back. I mean, despite what Andy was saying about them being the most successful party in Western democracy, they've got no automatic right to exist.
They have to run it. I personally think they will. I think they will eventually see sense and bounce back and be the main challenger to Labour.
Yeah, but in order to do that, they've got to turn into the sort of party that David Gauke could vote for. And they're nowhere near that.
They need to go back to where David Cameron was. I mean, Cameron won two elections, if you count 2010. And they seem to have forgotten that, incredibly. So much has happened since then with Brexit and Boris and Truss. But they need to go back to the centre. If they vacate the centre, then that suits Labour and the Lib Dems very nicely.
But it's absolutely true. I mean, successful political parties can come very, very close to death, if not die. I mean, I remember once ringing a French friend and laughing because I was polling 6 points behind the incumbent president when Hollande was on 6% in popularity. So it can happen.
Well, look, I'm sorry, I've just looked at the time and we're running out of time. All I need to do is say thank you very much for an absolutely fascinating discussion. I just need to tell viewers what is coming up on the Independent next week, our next virtual event with the Independent's travel team. That's going to be Simon Calder, the man who pays his way, the great Simon Calder, is going to be answering your questions. The panel will be looking at the changing face of travel since the 1990s and asking Simon for his memorable moments, just as we were talking about our memorable moments about the election. If you want to sign up for the View from Westminster newsletter, that appears Monday to Thursday when Parliament's in session, and my weekly Commons Confidential email, which is available to subscribers, giving you a view of what's going on behind the scenes in Parliament. All of that is available on the website, so do sign up for that. And thank you very much to Andy Grice, Kate Devlin, and Anand Menon. I think that is just about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.